These gang leaders, once thought to be living it up and enjoying themselves behind bars, are actually facing a brutal existence in this very massive, unforgiving mega prison. Gone are the days of caviar and cushy accommodations. Here, the inmates barely have enough to eat, let alone proper bedding. It's a far cry from the adoring crowds and fancy jumpsuits we might expect. Instead, these hardened criminals are forced to endure extreme deprivation and discomfort, side by side with their subordinates. But how do they manage to survive in such a harsh environment? Let's find out. Nightmare for gang leaders. Nestled in the ancient country home of El Salvador, stands powerful monuments whose walls and bars have become nightmares, especially to gang leaders. For the gang leaders in El Salvadoran prisons, it's really unimaginable and unbearable torture. Known as short callers, these very notorious and fearless individuals who wreaked havoc on the streets and wielded their influence so high on their subordinates have now been locked up in the thick walls and bars of El Salvador. Finding themselves now isolated from their usual power structures and support networks is one thing they had never imagined in their entire life. This newfound fate and life in such a toxic environment is highly volatile, with constant threats of violence from rival gang members. Many of these gang leaders struggle to maintain their authority and influence within the prison walls. They must navigate complex social dynamics, forge alliances, and find ways to protect themselves and their followers. This can be an exhausting and stressful experience, as they constantly have to be on guard. The lack of access to resources and basic amenities has also affected the gang leaders. They now have limited access to limited medical care, educational opportunities, or even proper nutrition, leading to physical and mental health problems, further worsening the challenges they face. But despite these difficulties, some gang leaders have found ways to adapt and even thrive in the prison setting. Some have had to use negotiation skills to broker deals with other gangs or leverage their connections to obtain certain privileges or resources. However, the constant threat of violence and the need to maintain their status can be a never-ending battle. But there is no doubt that the lives of these gang leaders in El Salvadoran prisons are marked by isolation, vulnerability, and the constant struggle to maintain their power and influence. It is a challenging and high-stakes environment that tests the spirit and resourcefulness of these individuals. But what does fate hold in stock for them? Well, let's peer into what their reign was like before the cold hand of the law descended on them like thick darkness. The reign of the gang leaders. Not quite a good number of people around the world believed the reality of El Salvador during the terrible reign of these gang leaders until the veil was lifted, and what the world witnessed lacked descriptive words to give it the true color definition. It's just overwhelming to think that in the span of just a few years, nearly 20,000 lives were lost to the brutal violence of the gangs, the infamous MS-13. That's an astounding and devastating statistic, especially when you compare it to the death tolls in other countries that were embroiled in actual wars during that time. The power and pervasiveness of these criminal gangs were just difficult for the human mind to comprehend. They've managed to infiltrate and take control of 94% of the municipalities in the country. Imagine living in constant fear, having to pass through these informal gang checkpoints to go to work or school, and being extorted by these MS-13 who come around to collect their renta or protection money. It's extortionary, and it shows how the gangs have become the de facto authorities in so many neighborhoods, exerting this tremendous control over people's daily lives. That was not enough. Talking about the level of bloodshed and retaliation between the rival gangs, like MS-13 and the two factions of Barrio 18, is a mind-blowing part of the whole story. The way they refuse even to say each other's numbers, the invisible but well-known boundaries of their territories. It's like they've created this parallel underworld that the general population is trapped in the middle of. No wonder people are living in constant fear, avoiding public spaces, and even staying inside after dark when the gangs are most active. It's heartbreaking to hear stories like Reina's, a 13-year-old girl who had to flee her home with her family after the gangs moved in and started throwing bombs and shooting at them. The fact that thousands of families have had to abandon their homes and flee north towards the United States border just to escape this relentless gang violence is truly devastating. And the way the gangs have managed to gain such a foothold, by providing a sense of belonging and community for young people from broken families and extreme poverty. It's a vicious cycle that's so hard to break. Even when the gangs claim to be providing community service by protecting locals from other criminals, it's clear that people are complying out of pure fear, not loyalty or gratitude. It's infuriating to see how politicians in the United States have seized on the threat of MS-13 to advance an anti-immigration agenda, deporting thousands of Salvadorans who have no involvement with the gangs, and denying asylum to those fleeing the very violence that the gangs are perpetuating. These are real people, victims of an impossible situation, who are being further victimized by these misguided and cruel policies. Origin of the gang. In the United States, particularly in Los Angeles, Latino neighborhoods were divided into different sections, including the Chinese neighborhood, the Black neighborhood, and the Latino neighborhood. Within the Latino population, there were two significant groups: Mexicans and Salvadorans. Salvadorans began to establish a presence in Los Angeles between 1980 and 1992, which coincided with the Salvadoran Civil War. During the Civil War, people from all walks of life were leaving El Salvador. Entire families, young individuals, as well as deserters from both the army and the guerrilla, sought to escape the violence. In Los Angeles, these Latino groups, similar to African American groups, faced challenging and marginalized lives. Originally, gangs emerged as self-defense groups aiming to protect the Latino community and their neighborhoods from encroachment and harm from other areas. One phrase commonly used by many of these gangs was, "Vivo por mi madre, muero por mi barrio." I live for my mother, I die for my neighborhood. It represented a commitment to defend the community from abuses. So, how did these gangs from Los Angeles establish themselves in El Salvador? In the 1990s, as the gang phenomenon in Los Angeles became more complex, the United States started deporting gang members. These deportations transported back to El Salvador numerous gang members who had committed crimes and even murders in the United States. Upon their return to El Salvador, the Civil War had ended, but the country faced numerous challenges. There was a lack of clarity on how to handle these deported individuals, and the infrastructure was insufficient. The National Police Force was still in its infancy, having been established in 1992 with peace agreements and composed of former military and guerrilla members. These circumstances made it difficult to address the gang problem effectively. The deportation of gang members back to El Salvador coincided with a complex social environment in the country. Family structures were broken, both financially and culturally. Violence has always been present in El Salvador, with a history of conflict, including the violent past of the Civil War and the extermination of indigenous people in 1932. It seems that violence has become ingrained in the country's identity, making it challenging to imagine El Salvador without it. Unfortunately, these gangs turned to criminal activities due to a lack of reintegration policies and support from the government. The absence of serious government programs left young people in a state of abandonment, and predatory behavior, such as killing and extortion, gained traction. The gangs transitioned into criminal organizations, with extortion becoming a prominent activity. Typically, these gangs do not have a political ideology. They tend to align themselves with political parties that they perceive as being in their best interest, or ones that respect them. They may support parties that do not repress them. Ultimately, the gangs fight over what they represent and their sense of identity. They have always been rivals among themselves, and these rivalries were fueled by the post-war environment in El Salvador. These young people lived in marginalized conditions, often worse off than their experiences in the United States. While they may have had some options in the United States and post-war El Salvador, with limited resources, infrastructure, and a lack of comprehensive focus on the problem, they faced more marginalization and repression. It is disheartening to note that children as young as 7 or 8 years old can be found involved with these gangs. However, the most common age range for gang initiation is between 12 and 16 years old. The government crackdown. Many never saw this moment coming in the history of El Salvador, a turning point that shook the city gates with ripples reeling through the nation for years to come. On the morning of March 27, 2022, the Salvadoran Legislative Assembly convened for an extraordinary session. Not their routine and conventional meeting, but this time, to make a decision that would shake the very foundations of civil liberties in the country. With firm determination, the lawmakers approved a state of exception, a sweeping measure that would grant the government unprecedented powers to curtail the rights of its citizens. The order, initially set to last for 30 days, would ultimately be extended an astonishing 14 times, each extension solidifying the government's grip on the nation. Under the guise of combating the scourge of gang violence, the state of exception suspended the rights of association and legal counsel, dramatically increasing the amount of time individuals could be detained without charge. The government also arrogated the authority to monitor citizens' communications without the need for warrants, casting a chilling shadow of surveillance over the populace. However, even these expanded powers proved insufficient for the authorities, as Salvadoran law enforcement was soon accused of blatantly violating the very limits imposed upon them. The government's heavy-handed approach extended to the judicial system as well, with new rules that severely restricted the ability of judges to offer prisoners alternatives to pre-trial detention, such as bail and house arrest. The legislators of Nuevas Ideas, the ruling party, wasted no time in tightening the noose further. They passed laws that dramatically increased the prison sentences for convicted gang leaders, from a mere 6 to 9 years to 40 to 45 years. For other gang members, the sentences were lengthened from 3 to 5 years to a range of 20 to 30 years. But the government's assault on civil liberties did not stop there. They also reduced the age of criminal responsibility, previously set at 16 years old, to a mere 12. A move that would have profound implications for the lives of countless young Salvadorans who were already being recruited into these criminal gangs much more early. The streets of El Salvador soon became a battlefield, as the government deployed additional police and military forces to conduct sweeping raids and establish checkpoints in neighborhoods known to harbor gang activity. Soldiers aggressively scrutinized identification cards, searched vehicles and backpacks, and refused to allow anyone to enter or leave without what they deemed a legitimate reason. The crackdown was merciless, and the numbers tell a sobering tale. By the end of that fateful March 27th, security forces claimed to have detained 576 people. Within a week, nearly 6,000 individuals had been arrested, overwhelming the already overcrowded prisons of El Salvador. But the government was not satisfied yet. They pressed on, pressuring the police, military, and judicial system to continue the mass arrests by setting rigid quotas. After just 1 month, more than 17,000 people had been taken into custody, and by May 25th, the shocking figure had reached over 34,500 arrests since the start of the state of emergency. Amid this human rights crisis, the government's callousness knew no bounds. Prisoners were subjected to inhumane conditions, with rations reduced to a meager 2 meals per day, consisting solely of beans and tortillas. President Bukele, unswayed by pleas for compassion, coldly proclaimed that he would not take the budget away from schools to feed these terrorists. The suffering of the incarcerated escalated further, as they were denied basic comforts like mattresses and subjected to the indignity of being frog-marched, a dehumanizing practice of forcing inmates to march with their hands behind their backs. Even while the turmoil was raging like wildfire, Bukele announced the construction of a new prison, one capable of housing 40,000 inmates, making it one of the largest prisons in the world. This terrorism confinement center, located in Tecoluca, opened its doors on January 31, 2003, solidifying the government's commitment to its unforgiving crackdown. The assault on civil liberties extended even to the grave, as the government initiated a policy of destroying the gravestones of gang members in a twisted effort to prevent them from becoming shrines. Minister of Justice Osiris Luna Meza declared that terrorists will no longer be able to glorify the memory of dead criminals, a move that Bukele himself likened to the denazification of Allied-occupied Germany. The government's relentless campaign reached a new level of intensity in December 2002, when they initiated a siege of the city of Soyapango. Deploying an astonishing 10,000 soldiers to surround the city, the authorities launched a massive operation to arrest gang members, erasing their graffiti from the walls as a symbolic gesture of dominance. Through it all, the state of exception has remained firmly in place, extended time and time again by the Legislative Assembly, where the ruling Nuevas Ideas party, along with its allies, have consistently voted in favor of the measure, while the opposition parties have staunchly opposed it. As the months have passed, the world has watched with a mixture of horror and disbelief, as the government of El Salvador has seemingly abandoned the cherished principles of civil liberties and human rights in its single-minded pursuit of eradicating gang violence. The consequences of this crackdown, both for the citizens and the nation as a whole, remain to be seen. But one thing is certain: the events of March 27, 2022 will forever remain a monument in the history of El Salvador and beyond the shores of the United States. A lesson and warning for gang leaders in other parts of the world, because when the table turns again, it might be more dangerous in some parts of the world. Now, it's time for today's subscriber pick. Here is a sight that you scratch your head countless times to even fathom what type of prison this is. A towering prison. Its daunting walls punctuated by suspended cages, like cylindrical baskets holding the most notorious gang leaders in captivity. This is no ordinary correctional facility. El Salvador spares no criminal elite. It has stripped them of their power and privilege, suspended in these stark, open-air enclosures that strip away their every comfort. Looking at this exposé, it's just so obvious that these guys are in for a mess in this prison, but the question becomes, how are gang leaders treated in El Salvador's prisons? The next part of this video got you covered with all the answers you need, but just to make the conversation spicy, please tell us what you think about these gang leaders and their ill treatment in this terrible abode prepared for their final resting. The reality of life in this prison. As one steps into these walls, you're confronted with a mind-blowing reality. A nightmare of human suffering unfolding behind its steel bars. In each cramped, 100-square-meter cell, around 75 of the most dangerous criminals in El Salvador cling to their metal bunks, forced to share just 2 meager toilets and sinks between them. These inmates, the suspected members of the notorious MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs, have been stripped of the most basic comforts. No mattresses, no chance to breathe the fresh air. Instead, they endure the constant brutality of the guards, beaten and tortured in this hellish environment as human rights groups sound the alarm. The cells themselves are stark and bare, with thick steel bars separating the inmates from their heavily armed jailers. It's a scene that human rights advocates have likened to the very concentration camps of the Nazi regime, a chilling comparison that underscores the horrors unfolding within these walls. When the Human Rights Commissioner himself visited this notorious prison, he insisted that the inmates were in good condition and that their rights were being respected. But the reality on the ground tells a far darker tale. A report by Cristosal, a human rights organization, documented 174 inmates tortured and killed in horrific violent deaths since this merciless crackdown began. As we hear the words of the inmates themselves, their stories paint a grim picture. This mega prison, built to house 40,000 inmates, is a stark symbol of the government's war on the gangs that have terrorized El Salvador for decades. But as rival gangsters are crammed under the same roof, the question remains: how can the authorities prevent the very violence they seek to quell from erupting once more within these confines? According to the Cristosal report, investigations found that in 39 out of 153 cases, the forensic experts couldn't determine the cause of death. For example, there's the case of a 23-year-old man who died on April 18, 2022. The report revealed his body showed signs of beatings, fractured hands and feet, and long burn-like wounds on his back, suggesting he may have been tortured. But the coroner's report listed the cause of death as sudden death. The report also found some instances where the cause of death determined by the forensic doctors didn't match the person's previous health conditions. Another issue is that some inmates were being buried in mass graves without their families being notified. Cristosal found at least 4 such cases, including a 45-year-old man with a disability who was buried under a different name, even though the autopsy said he died of pulmonary edema after apparently being beaten in prison. One of the main demands from inmates' families is just to know where their loved ones are being held, since many seem to effectively disappear without being properly accounted for by the justice system. Additionally, the report found that many inmates who are eventually declared innocent are leaving prison in extremely poor health, which then leads to their deaths. Like the 24-year-old man who was detained for 7 months, then declared innocent but died 2 days later from chronic kidney failure. According to the testimonies, The overcrowding, beatings, and downright cruel treatment are just a daily reality in El Salvador's prisons right now. One 20-year-old man from the prison said there was this guard they called Montaña, who would constantly threaten the inmates, telling them, "You'll only leave here alive if you're lucky." And the report said the guards would shock the prisoners with electricity while they were kneeling and draw blood from them. Another guy talked about how sometimes they'd only get a cup of water all day. And there was this awful incident where a guard brought them some food in a bucket but then just tossed it on the dirty floor and told them they had to pick it up with their mouths in 5 seconds, or else they'd get beaten. Can you imagine being that hungry and having to do that? It's heartbreaking. The report also mentions these tiny isolation cells that guards use to punish the inmates. They're dark and cramped, with no beds or toilets, and the prisoners in there barely get any food or water. The survivors say some people don't even come out of those cells alive. One guy described how after he got out of the isolation cell, he was so weak and malnourished that he ended up having a stroke. All these to pay the price for brutality and keep the nation safe from the reign and terror of notorious gang leaders. Reactions. The crackdown by the Salvadoran government on criminal gangs has been very popular with the people of El Salvador. An April 2022 poll found that 91% of Salvadorans supported the government's actions, with 78% saying they very much supported them. Many Salvadorans expressed that they were tired of the violence and lawlessness caused by the gangs. Even Salvadorans living in the United States have voiced their support for the crackdown. In general, people living on the streets of El Salvador say the atmosphere is much safer now. Citizens and observers report feeling much freer to go about their daily lives without fear of the gangs. One writer described how he used to regularly interview gang members who would openly hang out in the neighborhoods, but now their presence has been greatly reduced. The gangs are mostly in prison, have fled, or are in hiding. A researcher observed that the criminal gangs have largely disappeared from the capital San Salvador. As a result, vendors, shop owners, drivers, and pedestrians no longer have to pay the gangs for protection. Residents of neighborhoods once dominated by gangs no longer fear violent reprisals if they venture into another gang's territory. However, there are concerns about innocent people getting caught up in the crackdown. Some families say their relatives were arrested with little evidence. An advocacy group called the Victims of the Regime Movement has been formed to represent those who feel they were wrongly targeted. A veteran of the Salvadoran military, who supports the crackdown, has disputed claims of unreasonable arrests. He says the security forces have detailed profiles on the jailed gang members and don't just randomly detain people. The United States Institute of Peace has noted that while the gang's power has been greatly diminished, the government will need to plan for transitioning out of the state of emergency and figure out what to do with all the arrested individuals. There are concerns that if the government doesn't step in to provide education, jobs, and other services in the communities, other criminal groups could move in to fill the void left by the jailed gang members. But not when they've found the answer to the lingering question: how are gang leaders treated in El Salvador's prisons? The Salvadoran government has announced some initiatives to address these issues, like a school improvement program and the creation of community centers to provide young people with activities and support. However, activists feel more work is needed, as some areas still lack access to proper schools. The crackdown has drawn a lot of attention across Latin America. Leaders and politicians in Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador have all praised the tough measures and expressed interest in adopting similar strategies to tackle crime in their own countries. The crackdown has been especially popular in neighboring Honduras and Guatemala, where some groups have organized parades demanding analogous policies. On the other hand, the crackdown has also faced criticism from human rights groups, who are concerned about arbitrary arrests and the targeting of government critics. The United States government has urged El Salvador to respect civil liberties, even as it supports the fight against gangs. Generally, the crackdown remains hugely popular with the Salvadoran people, who are desperate for an end to the gang violence that has plagued their country for years. However, concerns remain about how the government will transition out of the state of emergency and ensure that the gains made are sustainable in the long run. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.